Hello and welcome to another Not Chilly podcast. This one is episode number 22, and we're doing a little short one here. We're actually finally committing to the series that we've been talking about. Not the Star Wars one, not the South Park one, but in fact, MASH. Because this is a short episode, I'm not going to dive into very much what it is. And make sure if you can, jump online and try find the episode of MASH. It's only they're only 20 minutes long, so very short. You can catch up with it and then have a look. Because if you're a big fan of the show, then you'll know it the moment you start watching the episode. So sit back and enjoy Josh and I talking about Season 8, Episode 9 of MASH. And thank you very much for being a part of this.
And I assumed that, because I don't bake. Yeah. I don't bake. So for some weird reason, I've always associated baking with people who are good cooks.
Yeah.
And what I realized was, no, he just knows how to make cake and muffins and stuff.
Yeah, which is fucked up.
All right, so what are we talking about?
Yeah, man. I don't want to.
I want to go get breakfast.
Yeah, dude.
I want to get breakfast.
Let's talk about an episode of MASH. Do you know what it's called?
One?
Mr. and Mrs. Who.
Yes.
Is that actually what it's called? Cause
it is. Season 8, Episode 9, and it premiered on November 12, 1979.
What?
Thanks, Plex.
So, just so everyone knows, this is a little podcast that Josh and I do. It's kind of just a shorter podcast. So we did a podcast before about what we thought. To be honest, it was probably more about what Josh thought about MASH. And
you had thoughts.
I had two thoughts.
You made the mistake of asking me questions about MASH.
I skipped through the episode and I'm just listening, trying to find moments where I'm talking. And it's Josh, me, Josh. I felt like doing a long intro just to get my voice in there.
You opened the door that no one's ever,
Oh no, but isn't it the whole purpose of my podcast? Haven't I just told?
No,
that's what I've said.
I find it's just you endlessly going on.
That's true. Yeah,
that's every episode is how I felt about it.
Oh.
But this episode, look,
yes.
If I was to just off the top of my head come up with a description of this episode, I'd say, Charles returns to the 407 7th after a trip to Tokyo with an uncharacteristic hangover and the uneasy feeling of a romantic entanglement. Meanwhile, the hospital struggles to find a cure for an outbreak of deadly hemorrhagic fever.
Where did you get that?
And
that perfectly
I mean, that's how I would. What do you mean perfectly read? That's just how I would describe what happens
and not what's on the
episode. Yeah, and not what's on a 50-inch television
and right next to us. Yeah,
20 centimeters from my head.
I literally cannot look away.
I can feel the heat from the fire. Where's the remote? Anyway, don't know. Somewhere.
Oh, you could leave it on. Leave it on. Right. Inspiration, and also I want you to feel the heat. Hot. Yeah. So these podcasts is going to be kind of a shorter little podcast about particular episodes. So if you want to listen to what we think about MASH as a whole, go listen to the other podcast,
and we'll cover 3% of what we think about MASH.
Yeah.
In that episode.
Yeah, that's right. And then throughout all these little episodes, you'll kind of get a much more detailed feel about what MASH means to us. But we're not going to try not to go into that kind of detail. Talking about MASH. This is why I love MASH. It's no. This is why I love this episode. So, yeah, you're right. So we start the episode off with Charles coming in, hungover as hell and struggling to recall his nights from before. This is that amazing thing that happens in MASH a lot, which is the dual story. One's kind of comedy, the other one is really serious and really important.
Yeah, I mean most sitcom format things, I'd say basically all sitcom things tend to have that A-B.
Yeah, but I feel like the MASH does it on a much wider scale. Yeah,
it does it very differently emotionally. Yeah. When they have an episode like this, so they've got that A, the A story being what happened with Charles, and then the B story being
this
there's this
fever,
hemorrhagic fever, and again, it's the 50s. No one really quite knew at the time what to do, and so they decide to try something.
And that's a beautiful point about this particular episode. It's not even that they decide to try something; they try something knowing full well that they could get in massive trouble for it. Because regardless of the outcome, the person was going to either die or they were going to have a chance to live. So, and if they died, or the patient died, then they would have. And they tried what they tried, they would have been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. But if they didn't, then he would have died anyway, regardless. And it's just terrible catch-22, I guess. I mean, I know I haven't read the book, so I shouldn't, quote that too much, but it's this really messed up situation where you...
Read what book?
The Catch-22.
Oh, right.
It's in the title.
The MASH thing? Right.
No, I really want to read that book. But there's something really, like, beautiful and tragic about that. And it also kind of leads me to that feeling of, like, it must be like in war and why there's a lot of, like, dodgy stuff that goes on. Because there's a massive difference between someone who looks at the war as a whole, like this is the 20% statistic of people who die from this fever, and someone who literally has to deal with one patient and goes, why can't we fix this? Why can't we help? And this is a great example of that.
Oh, yeah. So the hemorrhagic fever, as they represent it in the episode, bearing in mind they had like really good medical consultants on this show. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but they had really excellent... there was one who was consistent. They might have had some other special ones, but they had one guy who was, I think he was paid as like a consultancy fee for like the whole run, like 10 or 11 years. And he... Anyway, so basically, it's this hemorrhagic fever, and the people are... initially, they don't produce any urine. They're just holding on to all of their water,
fluids,
and then they let it all go, but to the point that they'll die. They just don't stop going to the bathroom,
which is that whole saline thing, because it's like running out of salts in your body.
But if you put any salt in, and saline is traditionally quite high in salt, that's the point. It's replacing things faster than you're, giving you heaps of it to compensate for the fact that your body's losing.
Yes.
And so like much higher than what your blood content of salt is.
Yeah.
And
overcompensating.
Yeah, exactly. So because the salt is known to exacerbate the problem and kill you, the army goes,
Stop it.
Don't treat them at all, knowing that somewhere between 10 and 20% of people will die from it. So they go, but 80, worst case scenario, 80% will survive, so don't treat that 20%.
Yeah.
And they're given that thing of saying you'll be dishonorably discharged if you go against this order. And so they come up with a scheme whereby, not even a scheme, just a treatment. They make the decision to
take a risk.
To take the risk and give them less than 1% salt saline solution, and which is around the same amount that blood plasma has, which you just naturally have in your blood anyway. So they've assumed it would work okay, and it works out. But that scene where they're talking about making the decision, the thing that's interesting, and there's a reason why they stay on Potter for making the decision. It's not just because he's a leader, but when he's like, either we run the risk of these boys dying by doing nothing and hoping they survive, or we give them the treatment. We either don't treat them, and we basically know that this young man is going to die. In particular, this patient is on his way to death. Or we do something and maybe he dies, but maybe we save him at the cost of all these things. Bearing in mind, it's the 50s. He's been in the military since like 1915.
Yeah.
So it is his life. That's his entire life. He's very close to retirement, and that's a thing they cover quite a bit in MASH. They'll have throughout it sort of a few colonels here and there that are in their older age, and they're looking for the glory, and they're looking for the last promotion. They're looking for things at the cost of lives, and so that's just kind of an important moment of note that's how good a person Potter is. He's really willing to risk everything he's ever built in his life to
save people.
To save people, because he's a doctor before anything else.
Yeah.
And despite how regular army he is, he loves the army and believes in the army, but he believes in being a doctor even more.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think it's a really cool episode, and I think that like the other story as well, it's also kind of fun. Like this was actually a really positive episode, and a show that deals with a lot of trauma. This one comes out like quite a positive spin, which is well selected by you.
It's also one of the things that I love about MASH. That the A story being Charles getting drunk in Tokyo and thinking that he's married a woman in his drunken haze, and he's so protective. It shows all the negativity of him, and then shows what's underneath.
Yes.
And they do that throughout the series. It's one of my favorite things is that, they couldn't do that with Frank while he was in the show before Winchester, because there was nothing more to Frank. He just was a piece of shit. And they'd set him up in that very one-dimensional way. And so when they started over with Winchester, they very carefully went, okay, we need to have an antagonist who is layered. And so on the top layer, well, I'd say the middle layer, really, at the core of Winchester, he has all these nasty things like protection of bloodline and all. That's why he's so upset when he finds out that he's married a person. He has all these cultural, racial elitism ideas that are addressed in other episodes, but that's the motivation in this episode for him being so upset about it. It's not just, oh, that's something so silly that I can get annulled. He's really worried about how it will damage him, his name, his family, if he gets, stuck.
Well, it's a real character decision and a real character reaction that he makes when he realizes what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, it's not I'm making a comment about something random. It's like, no, this is what he would have felt. This is literally, and then like we see it break down like bit by bit, and we see that beautiful nature come out. Like, he's a really sweet character. Yeah,
and it's not just shown in other episodes like in that type of way. And I just wasn't in the mood to watch a sadder episode.
That's fine.
There's a couple of more solemn episodes that are really beautiful that show what humanity he has. And
this is why I think that, like, the one thing I really liked about Charles entering MASH compared to Frank was the fact that despite like him being pompous and like a nose up in the air kind of person, all of them still kind of like him. They would do good things for him if they had to. Like, they irritated by him, and he's annoying because of his ideas about people and in class. But they certainly do really like him. They treat him like a friend. They treat him like someone close, and they care for him. And you see in this episode, even though they're making fun of him, they do care, like, in that really boyish kind of push you.
Yeah, and even with Frank, they would try to help him. Like, the most evident part of that is in Frank's last season, which is after Margaret's gotten married and Frank is falling to pieces. In that last season, she's engaged rather. In that last season, they defend him and tell Margaret off, for instance, for being insensitive to him. And it's one of those things where you're doing something for someone who would never do that for others.
Yeah.
He never thinks about it.
But I also think that's kind of like a proving ground for Hawkeye in particular, that for him it's like he wants to give someone a chance. He wants to give someone enough rope to hang themselves with. Like, he would be like, here, I'm going to help you. And if they keep pushing back, keep being a terrible person and not showing any kind of vulnerability, then eventually he would break.
I think it's less that and more his refusal to give up on humanity. So there has to be something deeper inside everyone. Because otherwise, what's the point? Like, why don't I just go get a pistol and shoot myself?
Right. That's really sad and depressing. But yes, but it's the reality of the show.
I think that Hawkeye is Hawkeye is a severely depressed person through the entire run of the show. He has severe depression. It's just a part of who he is.
PTSD.
He uses alcohol. Yes, he will have, I suppose. Like,
I think this is the kind of the story of his PTSD. I think,
how it develops. Like, but he's in the trauma at the moment.
That's right.
He uses alcohol to manage and all that kind of stuff. And it's one of the things is that in the day in day out, like, there's some great episodes throughout that talk about boredom in the camp, and Winchester coming back and there being this drama that happens would be, it's what he behaves like a 14-year-old when all this stuff is happening with the marriage and fake marriage, as it turns out, and all that kind of stuff. So you had to see a lot of the playfulness, and then as we've said, that's the beautiful thing about MASH is the contrast. So it'll go from the playfulness, then now we have to save some lives, then back to the playfulness.
That was the point I was going to make, because I remember thinking specifically about the sarcasm and the joke telling through both those, because even in the serious moments they're still saying jokes.
Oh, yeah.
But the tone is totally different. And if you were to compare that to like Friends, for example, if Friends was talking about something serious, they either do your really laugh out loud slapstick joke over a serious moment, or they talk really seriously, like, now we've got to talk properly.
Yeah.
Whilst MASH manages to keep the tone of the serious tone, but also keep the jokes into that serious tone, and this is a perfect example of it.
Because the core of the show and the reason they could make a comedy show is that the comedy was the coping mechanism of the people, of the characters in the show. So it's not just, we're here to entertain the audience. It's that's why I felt a lot of people who complained about the tone getting more serious as the show went on. I think then that they never really understood the show, to be honest, because the show, the entire point of the humor was, this is the coping mechanism that these characters use. So yes, it's funny, but it's not, it has a dual purpose. It has a purpose in the narrative of demonstrating that's how they cope, and it has the television show purpose of entertaining you.
Yeah.
And if you don't explore the darker bit of it and why that comedy in the war exists, then you're not appreciating what the purpose of the comedy is.
Yeah. I think I laughed probably 3 times in that, and there were probably like 30 or 40 moments which were kind of, you could imagine a laugh track would have been thrown in if it was, if it was still happening.
Yeah.
And I think
that's the all of these episodes have laugh track removed. This is the last season with a laugh track.
Yeah, there you go. I remember you telling me about that. But either way, it was I didn't look down upon the episode at all. I didn't think of it lower because I laughed less. I just laughed when I felt it was right to laugh. There was like really hilarious moments.
I mean, yeah. It's also just, particularly when you watch it without the laugh track, it really starts to sink in just how many jokes there are in every episode.
Oh, yeah.
Because it just doesn't stop. Everything all the time, wordplay in particular, wordplay is just constant.
Slapstick and just like prodding. It's just...
It's
like I said in the MASH podcast that I think is coming up tomorrow, or like, anyway, this doesn't make a difference to this timing, and it was they have some of the best puns in all TV because they pretty much do every single pun that you could possibly do. Like, it's crazy. But there was an interesting comparison. There's another episode of this podcast which I'm going to refer to. There's so many that I'm referred to, which is a sign of how much MASH really means to us. But I'm about to upload as well the Jarhead episode.
Oh yeah,
and the without actually comparing them one to one, because they're not like based off each other, it's really interesting to talk about that boredom again, and going like when the guys in, was it Afghanistan? Where do they go in Jarhead?
Well, they're in Saudi Arabia, but they're on the border of Iraq.
There you go. And when they just have nothing to do for months and months, you just see how they act up and they do stupid shit to each other and they play with each other, and it's like, and it's kind of messed up to some degree, but it's just sheer boredom.
Yeah,
you know. And when you see this episode come in and you see the way that those boys behave when he gets back from Tokyo, that's the most, like you described, that's the most interesting thing that's happening. We're gonna just mess with this and play with this as much as you can, like getting a new toy.
Yeah.
And I love that, like this show and that movie they weren't made for each other, but they're made about war, and they talk about a massive aspect of it, which actually I don't think is really appreciated in war storytelling, is that boredom.
Yeah, is the amount of nothing that happens. I mean, it's sort of like the focus is traditionally in anything to do with combatants, and so you don't think that the vast majority of any military is not guys with rifles or people in planes or it's engineers, it's mechanics, it's doctors, it's strategic people, it's intelligence, it's it's on D-Day there was 1.5 million people involved.
Jeez.
Right? That's literally just on that morning. That's not how many people were involved entirely. Hugely more than that in its entirety. But in terms of who was there on the day on the Allied side, it was 1.5 million people. In all the ships, in all the landing crafts, in all the blah blah blah. The minority by far were the people who went into France. And so like what is never really shown is the distance in time between things, and the slowness of stuff that happens. It's, if you're in World War One, the majority of your time was spent at the back, and you'd slowly be rotated to the front, then you'd go and you'd die. If you didn't, you were lucky, you get rotated to the back, and then you keep being pushed forward to the front lines, and on and on and on. So it's not like they're sitting there with their rifles like shooting at the Germans in the front lines the entire time. And this war is no different. The most of the time is spent not doing anything.
Yeah. I love that storytelling. I think that there's a really there's a lacking of that kind of, like, we've heard so much of the drama of not just war but of any profession. It's like when you watch that show Extras. And it's like you got a whole show that's based around extras not being extras. Like they're not, like, I mean, sure, there's moments that they are, but it's mostly just them talking and waiting and how they interact with certain people. And it's a sign that there is so much storytelling that hasn't been exposed, because often we focus on what's the most important thing about whatever this thing's about, and
from the broadest point of view possible, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, yes, if we're hearing about, if it's in the extras, right? If we're hearing about a new movie that has Kate Winslet in it, everyone's going to be talking about Kate Winslet, not the, probably 500 cast and crew who had
that's right.
to do it. They'll talk about the most, 3 in brackets most important people, and
that's some of the most, like, that's actually quite, like, I'm not sure if anyone else or how many people actually really feel this, but I get really allured by the behind the scenes when I did a doco ages ago, and like as a music thing, and for obvious reasons I'm not going into any detail about what that was about, but I remember what really fascinated me was just talking, I mean, I'm a sound guy, but just talking to the people who sound engineered that, or talking to the logistics person, and not even how did you do this, but more just like, how are you doing? Like, what's going through your head? Like, what do you like having for breakfast? When do you eat breakfast? Do you like get up like an hour before everyone else because you have to think about, I find the mundane in the extreme is super interesting.
I think that it's it's quite funny. I'm writing a blog post at the moment that's about, I'm starting a series of blog posts for Bucking Mouse that are like about directing.
Check out barkingmouse.com.
www.barkingmouse.com.au.
That's where you can find Josh in Georgia.
It's about directing performances, and the first blog post is about tone on set, right? Mm-hmm. And a huge part of it is basically that idea. It's like what you're talking about is just being basically interested in things to understand what people are going through in their day. Like I was talking to someone the other day.
Really?
I didn't sleep well. I haven't eaten breakfast yet.
That's right. Well, that's what we're doing after this.
But I was saying, like, what an armorer's day is like,
Yeah.
Oh, it was Matt. That's who it was. We were talking about gun regulation and how it's different here and all that kind of stuff, and we were talking about how good it is that it's so secure here, and I was giving the example of what an armorer's day is like, and a sort of armorer comes to set and looks over, the safety stuff is what we know an armorer for, the expertise part is what we know them for, but do people think about the fact that an armorer's day is incredibly long? They have to go, say it's a normal day shoot that sort of, starts around, they have to be on set at 7 o'clock or whatever, and there for 11 hours. They have to have, depending on the structure of how they do things, but this is just an example, like they'll have a company that owns a warehouse that vaults their weapons. They as an individual have to go to their own company in terms of paperwork, sign out the guns, and process everything for because it's a company the company is a separate entity from them as an individual. So they go and do that, then they'll go and do all this stuff, then they have to maintain the guns at the end of the day, clean them, do all that stuff, put them back, do the thing. And so it's this thing of, they're not just showing up and bringing guns, you have to have an appreciation for the fact that however many shoot days they have. And that's with everyone else, right? It's like most crew members have that, but one of the key differences with an armorer is it has to go back to the vault each night. It's not just go
home, check your bag, and
it's not lock the studio. It's not this. It's not put it in the van. It's not just leave it in the truck. It's this whole process. And that's that thing. Is that that's just having it's just that interest in How did that happen? Though, how did they be on that set? So the question you're asking in the context of MASH is basically when that person gets hit by a mortar, I get that a medic gets them, but what happens after that?
Yeah.
And that is the brilliant part of MASH, which is an interesting tangent, but maybe
No.
I mean, people can judge for themselves.
We just got to be careful not to re-loop this again and again. That's the
totally.
I'm happy to talk about it as long as we don't every episode talk about this exact
No. But we've addressed boredom in MASH now.
Yeah.
Although until we get to an episode that talks entirely about boredom.
We will, and that's fine, because then we'll talk...
I can't remember the name of the episode. There's an episode that starts with just in the mess tent and Hawkeye's going, I'm bored. Bored. And then the whole episode's about...
No talking about other episodes. Josh!
You brought it up.
I did. Yeah, I think that's really good. I mean, the other element I just want to bring up really quickly is about Charles, because we talked a lot about the
Chuck?
Fever. Chuck. Even those little jokes at him are great. But I love the lady that he meets and how much of a bond they share. It kind of like... There's something really beautiful with, like, especially with his character, like, who's kind of made out to be like, oh, you're supposed to, like, roll your eyes whenever he talks. And then I actually felt the opposite. I was actually really happy for him when once he had broken and figured it all out and figured everything was fine and he could just be himself. He was just like really joyful and excitable, and he was just having and you want them to get together because you're like, oh my god, you guys are so good for each other.
Yeah.
And it's really beautiful, and I think that was a great example of that kind of moment.
It is, and it's sad. He always has that mentality of people are just after my money and my name.
Yeah.
And that's
hopefully he like I can't remember exactly his whole story arc, which is probably part of the reason why I'm doing this. But hopefully that is something that he eventually nope doesn't change.
Doesn't change.
Way to end on a downer, Josh.
There's another episode with a far more intense romance that he has with someone, and they are very close to being, wow, we should make this, like, we should get married and be together after the war. And he breaks up with her for a very interesting reason.
We'll find that out later. Let's not talk about it anymore. Thank you very much for this little quick pod. Let's go get some breakfast.
Yep.
Bye. So that's the podcast for today. Stay tuned as there will be a new episode released every single Thursday. And to keep up to date, don't forget to subscribe using Podbean or wherever you get your podcast. On this episode again, I want to thank Josh Lundberg for coming back and giving us another awesome experience of his voice. This podcast was produced and edited by me, Piotr Wasilewski, and the music was sourced from the Filmstro website. Till next week, thank you for listening.